Hello, welcome. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Jane Louise Wilson as a long-time admirer of their work for this latest in the RCA Fine Art talk series. Jane and Louise Wilson have been working as part of an artistic collaboration for over 2 decades, graduating in 1989 with a joint degree show in Dundee and Newcastle, where we were studying in separate institutions. They then undertook an MA at Goldsmiths, graduating in 1992. Since the 1990s, they've gained a national and international reputation as artists working with photography, moving image, and installation in an expanded form of cinema and lens-based media. Their early work centred on abandoned buildings, often imbued with the presence and ideology of the original occupants. Through carefully choreographed film installations, sound works, and photography, they have explored some of Europe's least accessible sites, including a former Stasi prison in the former East Berlin, the British Houses of Parliament, and the huge Stasi City complex in Moscow, a key site for the Russian space program. In 1999, they were nominated for the Turner Prize for their multi-screen installation Gamma, that was on show in 2015 at the Schaulager Museum, Basel, in the exhibition Future Present. A recent commission for the Imperial War Museum, London, shown in October 2014 to January 2015, will tour to Mima, Middlesbrough, and Wolverhampton Art Galleries in 2016. The completed film installation, Undead Sun, was commissioned by the Arts Council of England and the Imperial War Museum to mark the centenary of the First World War. Using the Imperial War archives, they look specifically at the archive images of early surveillance and camouflage techniques employed during World War I, building on their long-standing interest in technology and the architecture of conflict. The film explores the perspectives on visibility technology and the reconstruction of narratives around that period. Their photographic series Sealander, taken along the Normandy coastline of the bunkers that form part of the Atlantic Wall, were recently on show at the Volkwang Museum, Essen, in the exhibition Conflict, Time and Photography, which was also shown here in London at Tate Modern. Future projects will include a 2-person exhibition at Mima Middlesbrough, a presentation of photographs at the John Paul Getty Museum, LA, in 2017, and a presentation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, in 2018. Jane is a board member of DAX and, as we all know, a senior tutor here in Moving Image at the RCA. Louise is a board member of the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art and is a part-time senior lecturer in fine art at Northumbria University in Newcastle. Jane and Louise are both honorary visiting professors of fine art at the University of Wolverhampton, and they are represented by 303 Gallery New York and Helga de Alvea Gallery Madrid. So please join me in welcoming them for this lecture this afternoon.
Thank you, Jo. That was very kind of you to do that introduction. Obviously for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jane.
I'm Louise.
It's a bit too Ronnie's, but anyway. So we're going to start with just a selection of works. And really, we wanted to start with something that I think is the work that we graduated with when we created those joint degree shows, as you were talking about. And it was somewhere that started in a very humble place, which was our parents' garage. So.
Like Jo mentioned, thank you, Jo. But just to follow on from what Jane was saying, that actually, because we were studying in separate colleges, art colleges, I was in Dundee and Jane was in Newcastle, that we started collaborating, sort of 300 miles apart, but we were making these images, photographic setups, mise-en-scenes that involved each other in a kind of performance or in a reference to performance. So the panel on the left, as you look, is almost before the event, and the panel on the right is kind of during the event. So it's meant to be kind of this performative, kind of time-based work in photographic medium before, of course, we started doing moving image. And we made 2 of everything. And Jane's show was in Newcastle, mine was in Dundee, and it meant that the colleges were assessing the same work. So if they failed one and they passed the other, of course, it would have been the same work that they were judging. So in the end, the colleges decided to collaborate.
Which was quite interesting. I mean, we would have been happy to have had one pass and one fail, but we both got the same grade, but never mind.
Yeah.
So interesting to see how it unravelled.
But I mean, just these were large black and white prints. They're about, you can't really tell much on this slide, but they're about 5 feet by 6 feet. And we used to print them, roll them in garden troughs, in Dev and then in Fix.
We didn't put them in any stop bath because there wasn't the facilities. But
it was when Ilford printed rolls of paper that big. Black
yeah,
and
this
white.
is going back to 1989, so it's a while
They no
ago.
longer do it. Okay,
Yeah.
so and quick move to this is a work called Hypnotic Suggestion that was made in 1993.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess this was the first video installation that we created, and it was a single screen projection piece that involved myself and Louise several years ago. Obviously, as you can see from the image, undergoing hypnosis, and it was we worked with a Portuguese hypnotist and an English hypnotist, and we did very simple suggestion techniques, which was the Ericksonian techniques. One was a hand levitation, and the other was a coin drop. So that would have been the key to then enter into this relaxed hypnotic state. And I guess what we were very interested in is this concept that, Cocteau had said all cinema is a form of mass hypnosis, and there was something about that idea of the creative, of the film move in terms of the camera when it pans away from the scene. So obviously, as we enter into this sort of hypnotic state, the camera slowly pans up to reveal this full screen of a blue curtain. And it's that sort of transition of where you imagine what's happening behind the screen, but on the screen it brings in all those other kind of associations. But also it's very much about a perception shift and a shift in terms of consciousness, as sort of suggested by the hypnotic suggestion. So just to say that this is an installation view of. You can see all the slides. Stasi City, which is a piece that we did when we went to Berlin. We were invited to do a DAD residency there in 1996. And we created a film installation called Stasi City from the time that we were there. It was working very much looking at sites, I suppose, that had not been documented. And for us, it was very key for us to see something that talked about a recent history and a history that was developing, as this is, hopefully.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just a bit temperamental.
Good.
It's Tommy's fault.
Oh, is it? Oh,
Yeah.
dear. So anyway, Stasi City, I just want to say some words here. Stasi City is a chilling marriage of subject, form, video, especially in the context of an organisation like the Stasi. It's inevitably associated with surveillance and surreptitious image gathering. It's a clandestine activity. So to see these images gathered from the deserted hallways and offices of the Stasi building and then projected in such an epic form is deeply disturbing. The installation conjures feelings of unspeakable dread as a viewer is forced to imagine the latent narratives that will never be spoken. Stasi City is a brilliant exploration of the banality of evil as expressed in an obsessive detailing of its abandoned shrine. So what I just opened with there, sorry, I should have paraphrased, was a quote from the director, Atta Magoyan, who very nicely wrote something about the work when we produced it. But he very much pithily describes what we were looking at. And so just wanted to talk about Stasi City and also Gamma, which was produced.
These are just some,
talk about
just
some
yeah,
slides.
just some. This is an installation view. Stasi City and Gamma, for example, which consists of two pairs of screens of projections on walls meeting at two 90-degree angles, diagonally positioned opposite from each other. The architectural layout of these installations, 2 points of view shown simultaneously and bound together, mirrors a kind of psychic architecture. This architecture vision reveals a double vision, but most often pairs up, and this is the case with both Gamma and Stasi City. This is an installation view from Stasi City from 1997, and these are some of the large format photographic works that were made whilst we were
well, prior to filming.
Yeah,
usually.
prior to filming. This is in the former Stasi prison in Hohenschönhausen in East Berlin. This is a still from the film, and this is in another large production still that was from Gamma, and Gamma was made in 1999. It was filmed in the decommissioned missile base in Greenham Common.
So it was interesting. We wanted to go to Gamma was shot in a former US Air Force base at Greenham Common, a Cold War operation that housed nuclear weapons, which was now decommissioned by the MOD. So our installation wanted to really, I suppose, examine what these spaces were in terms of being spaces of inspection and surveillance and control rooms and security zones. So we were very keen to kind of almost, in a sense, and how we intervened was to sort of mirror exactly what was happening within the buildings, within the architecture and what had formerly been structured as. So in a sense, we were looking very much at the old silos, the old control rooms, areas that I suppose had been decommissioned, but were still subject to an inspection team, which would happen from the Russians would come in. The Russians would come over and inspect the
Russian
site.
team of inspectors.
Yes, the Russians, the whole. They would come over and inspect a site there on Greenham Common, and then there would be an equivalent inspection team that would go to an equivalent site in Russia, which would be an American inspection team. And so this ritual would continue until 2000, when the treaty expired. So there was this point where we were just in this sort of no man's zone between in 1999-98 when we were filming it, where it hadn't expired, and they were still continuing to do this, but obviously there was nothing there contained within the buildings, but the site itself was still referred to as the Gamma site, and so hence the name Gamma, and that was the zone that we were looking at to document. And it's interesting because in terms of the film itself, we did manage to power up quite a few things involving a generator and various other bits of kit that we used, but it did seem to, in terms of the filming that we shot, it seemed to seem that, you know, it was actually still active, which it obviously wasn't, but that was clearly something we wanted to resurrect in terms of the installation that we produced.
So I'm just going to read a brief piece here. It's just about that the installation, in fact, restages situations that were themselves staged in order to instill anxiety or fright. Figures hang in the space, evoking perhaps a deadly fear of death by hanging, or maybe they are just suspended in pending judgment. Suspended, that is, in a zero gravity of lengthy bureaucratic time. The space is carefully choreographed, devoid of human presence, with the closed doors that once imprisoned the investigated subject, now pushed wide open. The construction of the very space of fear is revealed. We can see the cheapness. We can see the fakeness of the psychic mechanism that was staged here, the mechanism that runs a theatre of terror. And I just wanted to pick up this image here in particular because there are these padded double doors that were used in the interrogation rooms. And in actual fact, the walls were incredibly thin and you could hear quite easily from room to room. But it just had this kind of theatre, if you like, of soundproofing, which actually didn't function. But to give you some example,
I think that was very key for us to look at somewhere that really you couldn't really intervene too much because it was still uncertain what was happening to the site, whether it was going to be a memorial or whether it was going to be pulled down or what was going to go in terms of processing what was left. And so we were very clear that we would do very little intervention as much as we could, really, which was a clear sort of decision in terms of having an ethical approach towards it, if you like. But it was also something that I think bringing in lights and bringing in a track and bringing in a dolly and just very simple interventions like that and putting those things into the space, but not actually interfering with the space and just revealing what it was a way of kind of, heightening that theatricality, but also showing what was left of that, but also in a sense, it had that weird dislocation of being something that really was, like Louise said, quite theatrical in terms of how it tried to show its terror, or not terror, but how it tried to show its power, but also just seeing what was residual and what was left there and trying to kind of, indicate something of that.
And I guess what, just to follow on from that we were thinking of it sort of, the camera was meant to interrogate these places of interrogation. And that's how we sort of went about thinking in terms of the filming. So we're
yes,
moving swiftly on.
This is a very expanded installation that we created of 13 screens. It's called
6 years later,
Yes,
2003.
2003, yeah. This is a piece called Free and Anonymous Monument, and it was created for the Baltic Centre of Contemporary Art in Gateshead. And the work was really a social inquiry into the architecture around regeneration and the building of a new town and the industries in the northeast of England. It was a work rooted very much in digital media, and we were very keen to create an immersive spatial configuration of 13 projection screens, which would be based on the Apollo Pavilion, designed by the artist Victor Passmore, who once said, "Artist and architect speak the same language. Urban environment is an artificial landscape, so the process of constructing it is not unlike making a pictorial composition through which you move imaginatively along the road, down the path, through the trees, round the corner, over the hill. Space is a function of feeling."
I think you can sort of see from this that some of the screens were suspended overhead, some were on 16:9, some were 4:3, some were floor-based, some were portrait, but they all corresponded to the planes of the Passmore Pavilion. So it was trying to kind of make a kind of physical, spatial, filmic architecture. And also thinking about the way that Passmore described the experience of being in the Apollo Pavilion. I mean, he described it himself as a free and anonymous monument, which we thought was a really interesting starting point. He described it as a free and anonymous monument through which to walk through, on which to view from, and from which to play. And I sort of think that's a really interesting way to think about interacting in a way that that we do with installation. So you could actually stand in the work and stand outside the work, and there were lots of ways to kind of approach viewing it. Really, you couldn't see it all at once.
So I just wanted to add, there's a statement here from a writer, Juliana Bruno, who wrote very eloquently about this work, and she said, "The spatial conception present in Passmore's art migrated easily into the urban planning, for both art and urban design were thought of as practices of space. Indeed, as Corbusier notably and exemplified in his notion of an architectural promenade, architecture is appreciated while on the move with one's feet, while walking, moving from one place to another. A true architectural promenade, constantly changing views. It offers unexpected and sometimes surprising encounters."
I'll just finish that. Juliana Bruno continues, "The Apollo Pavilion was constructed of several layers of abstract forms and flat planes, which intersected to create a sculptural third dimension for a space. In a free and anonymous monument, the 13 two-dimensional screens are placed around the space at angles of vision that bespeak the same architecture as the pavilion. The screens, that is, are designed as if they were planes of vision, and positioned in such a way that they enhance the intricate layers of visual intersection present in the pavilion. They create a kind of volumetric, plastic architecture of vision that Passmore himself had striven to achieve in his own design. Furthermore, the 3 screens placed on the ground of the installation correspond exactly to the 3 planes that are the concrete supports of the real-life pavilion." So I think there's a shot here of the 3. Maybe it's further down here. Here. So it's actually supporting. So these are, the end bits are actually a kind of, they weren't concrete, of course, but they were a sort of render to look like concrete, but based on the undercroft and the entrance to the pavilion. So you had an entrance and an exit, but then you could just move freely through the space.
I mean, there were several attempts to remove the pavilion. I mean, it was pretty much, when we first went to document it back in 2001, 2002, it was very detested by the local community. And I think it had been a period of time when they'd been trying to get rid of it. And I think they found that actually to try and remove it would have taken, a
small H-bomb.
Small H-bomb.
Funny that, yeah.
It's,
Following on thematic.
Well, yeah, because obviously because of the concrete, because it was, this was a real solid mass of form. I mean, he wasn't a sculptor for nothing, Passmore, but obviously it was a real solid, even though the concrete itself was breaking apart and rotting and things. And they would clip the lawns that were surrounded it in terms of it, because it was a bridge over a stream. which was all meant to be very nice and landscaped. But they would go around and they would clip the area around the stream and everything, but they wouldn't touch the actual anywhere where the bridge was, where the pavilion was, and it was kind of covered in litter. It was, the whole thing was just, depressing, and obviously they just kind of completely disowned it. But interestingly enough, it did get saved, which was amazing. So it does mean now that because it's listed, it was preserved and National Heritage have kept it. So it is now no longer left with shopping trolleys and trash underneath it, and you can walk underneath it and enjoy the promenade. And I think they've even reconfigured the upstairs, because that used to be shut because, of course, people would get up to various activities. I don't know whether it was like, drugs, God knows what, but it was that kind of, within that estate you could hide up there and do whatever. So it was often that would been sealed off and you couldn't get up to the upper level, but that's all been kind of cleaned out and opened out, and it's now something that you can appreciate for what the design was. But I mean, it had quite a history.
And I think just to sort of follow on from that, I think Passmore had gone back to see the pavilion in the early 90s, or maybe late 80s, and it was really graffitied, and he actually really embraced the fact that it had been so embraced, so called by just by the community in a way that it was being used perhaps for nefarious activities, but actually it was being embraced, and he sort of celebrated that in a way that that it had a life of its own in a way, and that it hadn't become this sort of a kind of staid monument that was about perfection in a way. It'd been kind of a more organic interaction with it, So he was happy with that, and we managed to film it at that point when it was covered with graffiti. So we're quite happy to have filmed that. But just to say that because it was 13 screens. We'd only ever normally edited 4 screens at one time, and you could do a 4-way split on an Avid and work the sound and image together. But obviously trying to do 13 was quite a different, achievement in a sense, because it was 2003 and we were still sort of early on in a way. So it was. I think the hardest thing was actually trying to edit the sound. Really, visually it was quite straightforward, but then editing the sound, because each screen had its own individual soundtrack as well. So it was came away from that editing feeling quite a migraine several days.
We're lucky because initially, of course, when we did do the design of the installation, the pavilion, when it does break down into terms of linear and horizontal planes, which is how we decided to create this design, it was actually 26. So it was just as well we brought it down to 13. So we just halved it and kept it on the ground floor. But it was a very, it was very close to something, a symbiosis of what was the original architectural template, which is why it was the 13 screens, just to clarify.
Yeah, and also finally, before we move on, just to say what, of course, was really exciting about it was to see it all running together in a way, because we hadn't reached that point ever in the editing process, and it wasn't until we actually installed the work and could have it all running that we could actually see it then, and that was really exciting.
And I mean, obviously some of the formats are shifted in terms of 4:3, which was much more for ground-based, the floor-based screens, to 16:9, which were the suspended screens and the overhead screens, and using the mirrors to obviously project down for some of those overheads also created other refracted views. So there was very much this kind of this kind of immersive encounter, which is what we wanted.
So Jane, do you want to
Okay. In 2008, we were invited to make a short animated work online for the Arts Council and organisation Animate. The commission gave us access to the Kubrick archive based in LCC, which is in Elephant Castle. And it's a vast archive of ephemera, paper and photographic artefacts. All of the film material is owned by Warner Brothers and held in the US, so we weren't able to access the film material. So we as a starting point, we're very interested in looking at the film projects, specifically the film projects that had not been realised by by Kubrick. Actually, that's a bit of a slip of the tongue, because I think Kubrick was a bit of a Napoleon, but anyway, an amazing filmmaker. Had never been realised by Kubrick, of which there were 2 films, Napoleon Bonaparte and another film entitled The Aryan Papers, which was based on the book Wartime Lies by the writer Louis Begley. The book is based on a true account of an aunt and her nephew who managed to escape the Warsaw Ghetto and pass themselves as Catholics with forged Aryan identity papers. The following images, if we go through, are from the Ealing Film Studio archive, which was acquired by Kubrick from his research into Aryan papers. The images were all taken in the 30s and 40s, and each image features a yardstick, now a relatively obsolete measure. But then they were used as measures for scale in the reconstruction of architectural details and for the use of set design, in particular for the design of film sets. So we found these photographs particularly fascinating in the forensic detail of the way the yardstick was placed, like clues, providing evidence of the presence of human scale without actually featuring people. And in some ways, it mirrored our own activity in creating Unfolding Aryan Papers, in which we tracked down the actress who Kubrick had cast in the lead role. Her name was Johanna Tersteeg, and we filmed a reconstruction based on the images from the original wardrobe shoot, which we found in the archive. And as well as staging an interview with Johanna using the original script, which had been developed for the film, we also had Johanna deliver her lines, the ones that she would have been potentially used as her character, Tanya. So, anyway.
Yeah, I just want to show this as an installation view of the work as it was shown in SIGAC in Santiago de Compostela in 2010. I think I might be able to screen a clip.
He said, I want to invite you for a screen test for a film. He was watching my gestures, and that he at a certain point looked at my arms and my hands, how they move when I talk. And I have this strange habit of putting my finger like this or like this, and I can see it back on the pictures. He was able to look at you, and he really, really looked. He really focused on something. He could say things like, can you please turn your head a little bit more, like 1 centimeter, and can you open your lips a little bit? And then I said, why? He said, well, because it's more sexy. He said, you just never close your mouth. When you look at this picture, you think, you don't know where I come from, which country. And that's what he was looking for. That's what I remember. He also asked me not to change my accent. He said, I really like your accent. Don't improve your English. You could come from everywhere. And that's what we need for Tanya, because we should not know where she comes from. That's good for the story, for the film. All right, but there's something else that must be done at the same time. I have found someone who can get us Aryan identity papers. When we have them, we will go to Warsaw, where no one knows us, and pass as Catholics. This has something to do with the vulnerability of the character. And also the girl in Tanya, that's what I see. Do not be frightened. And above all, do not appear to be frightened. Now go and wash your face. No one must see you are crying. I think he had something in mind, and he knew exactly what he was looking for. And I felt in that picture when he met me. And then when we talked and the way we discussed things, and was looking at my gestures, at my hands, and if I talk another language, like English is not my mother tongue, I start to explain, with my hands as well. I think he didn't need to talk about Tanya, because he was looking for a person, for a human being, and not for an actress who had to play a role. I'm sure about that. I have an important secret to tell you. I have a German friend. He is in love with me. His name is Reinhard, Major Reinhard Franz. He is in charge of my office. He isn't a Nazi. He isn't even a soldier anymore, although he wears a uniform. I read the script before I met him, so I knew the story and I really liked the story. What was so challenging that this role had so many different angles, and I would have been a chameleon, because to hide for the Germans and to have a relationship with a German officer and to protect the little boy of my sister and all the events she went through the war. So she always had to hide in a certain way, her identity and everything. It would have been wonderful.
All right. So just wanted to quote something from Peter Osborne, who'd written an essay called, in relation to this work, called Yardsticks, When Will the Post-War End, 2010. He describes the generative work of unfolding Aryan papers as a 16mm film that is itself constructed out of a series of 7 overlapping basic elements. The photographs from the Kubrick archive of the actress Johanna Tersteeg and her costume fitting for the character of Tanya in Aryan papers. The soundtrack of an interview conducted by ourselves with Tersteeg, recounting the story of her auditioning for the part and the subsequent abandonment of the project. The film and reenactment of the parts of the fitting by the same actress some 15 years later, with a narrative present in the interview. Snatches of film that we directed of the actress in character as Tanya, and tentatively adopting her role in the same setting as the reenactment of the costume fitting. A soundtrack of the actress reading parts of Kubrick's script. Kubrick's research materials in the form of black and white wartime photographs and scenes from the Warsaw Ghetto, the deportations, the partisans, civilian activities, German army specific scenes, and finally, and most importantly, from the standpoint of the unity of both the work and the exhibition as a whole, black and white photograph setups of the Ealing archive acquired by Kubrick.
Sorry about this, guys.
Film productions, don't worry.
It's just, yeah.
Film productions from the 30s and 40s in which the yardsticks were painted black and white rulers of lengths used to establish scale for measurement for the cameraman. Such yardsticks appear in the restaging of the scenes, both of the narrated costume fitting and the imagined film itself. As to the identity of the fragmented character with the early stages of Kubrick's own process of production, the yardstick thus functions to place various visual elements of the work with the exception of the real. of the wartime photographs into the same imaginary space, and they establish measurement already present in the idea of a costume fitting, and more in an extended sense in an actress fitting into a role as the main theme of the work.
So you can see the installation here was a single screen, but with mirrors either side, so it created a kind of infinity, but it also kind of, in a way, meant the image was reflected and repeated. So it kind of was almost this sort of idea of making an expanded cinema space, literally, in a way, but also thinking about how her story, in a way, is very much her becoming, in a way. So she never becomes the character, Tanya, although she was cast as the lead actress. She speaks her lines, but she never becomes we never know her role as such. And she also recounts her meeting with Kubrick. So I think we were very much interested in kind of creating this space, but also this visual sense of how a person might be in that space of becoming. So just finally, just here, Osborne continues, what is being measured here? What else but time itself? According to Aristotle, the measure or number of motion, the passage of time, from the Warsaw Ghetto to the early 1990s, and from the early 1990s to 2008. The latter is marked out on the body, and in particular, the face of the actress Johanna Testig. Time as loss of what is past, both its horrors and its opportunities. The guilt of losing the real horror of the Holocaust, Testig's lost opportunity to become a Hollywood star, and the huge disappointment she suffered. Time as history, measured in fragments, small pieces of time, carrying with them history and experience, through their relations to each other, like the refugees carrying their suitcases, describing the process of costume fitting and audition, the first stages of film production, during which she had started to try on her character, Tanya. Testig concludes, it's the start of an image.
So just to explain, I suppose there's a whole sequence in this film, which I don't suppose we're going to screen all of it, but if you do see, it goes into the archive images that Kubrick had collected in terms of referencing for his work. So there was all of these boxes that were related to the partisans, to the resistance, to the German army, to various things that you start to see of these images, and also to other parts of this kind of the Warsaw Ghetto, and so there was a whole sequence that follows on from this film, which is why he talks about these images that were revealed. So in June 2010,
I just wanted to kind of do one really quick thing, which is to say yardsticks are obsolete measures, not just because of changes in the technology of film production, but because of their imperial standard. The yard, which is 0.9 of a metre, 36 inches, and the inch is based on the British imperial system of measurement. Man, Antiquity, Empire, are all obsolete measures, obsolete and therefore subject to monumentalisation.
But I suppose Man, Antiquity and Empire could truly be the measure, couldn't it? Anyway, so there we go. So, and we go to...
Yeah, sorry.
We're getting there. In June 2010... You did a brilliant job. In June 2010, we visited Ukraine as an invitation of the British Council in Ukraine, and with the support of former arts and the media in UK. We were invited to specifically research the exclusion zone surrounding the abandoned site of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor plant. Whilst there, we visited the abandoned town of Pripyat, and while in the early 1970s under the former Soviet Union, it was built to house the Chernobyl factory workers, known as Atomgrad, Atom City, and once it was thriving new town had been left abandoned and contaminated for over 25 years. We felt strongly that the most appropriate way for us to think about making this work was through a series of still photographic works.
Yeah.
So if we go back where we were, then you can see it seemed that this would be the only way to show the extent of the aftermath of the physical destruction and deterioration of the town, was by showing the hyper-real detail offered with the large format photographs. Using a recurring motif of the yardstick placed within each of the interiors, there was a strong desire to make us conscious the act of entering and photographing these spaces, The photograph encourages to stare back into the past, into the empty man-made spaces, yet the yardsticks as a means of measurement were much like the buildings, play with notions and association and interpretation. But they also were often used there as the buildings themselves were often recorded, measured, articulated and analysed, much like the sense of the measure. So the work explores the thematics of dark tourism, using these yardsticks as forensic and literal measures to register with the viewer.
So this is, you can see it's inside what was the kindergarten. This is in the school gymnasium, so at points the measures would actually be measuring something, yeah. And in schoolroom. And
The
I'm
top
not sure if you can see
deck of a diving board.
that's on the top diving board, which is exactly 2 yards in width. In the schoolroom. And in the cinema, on the door. In a way, like Jane said, it was just literal. I mean, we had 4 days to work there. This was in the hotel, the Polisa Hotel, which was in Pripyat.
And the previous image was the People's Palace, which was the cultural centre.
But yeah, I mean, you can actually get a coach trip, or you can take a coach trip. You can get a bus from Kiev and go and visit Pripyat for the day, if you so choose. I mean, you have to be over the age of 18, but you can, easily go and do that. And I guess we were very aware that there is such a proliferation, like we were saying, of video and of images of this site. I mean, there's actually, I think there's a computer game which is called, is it Stalker?
Stalker, yeah.
Yeah, it's Stalker, where they use the kind of the exterior of Pripyat, shots of the exterior as location for this video game. So, there's a kind of there's a sense in which we really you really sort of felt it had been really examined and really analysed and really looked at in a way. But although we were conscious, that this site had been really documented, we were very intrigued to kind of go and visit once we'd been in Pripyat, to come back to Kiev and then go and visit the Kiev National Film Archive and just do some research there. And it was whilst we were at the Kiev National Film Archive that we found this film, which was a film made by a Ukrainian director called Vladimir Shevchenko, and it was called Chernobyl, A Chronicle of Difficult Weeks. Shevchenko actually managed to film with 2 or 3, I think 3 assistant cameramen to go and to film the cleanup operation inside the exclusion zone. And if you imagine that, I think the explosion happened on the night of the I think it was the end of April 1986. He was actually filming in May 1986, so he was like literally within a matter of weeks he was in there filming the cleanup operation. And this is actually a still of Shevchenko, his assistant cameraman Victor, and an image of they're carrying a Russian Bolex, which is called a Convas Aftermat, which became the kind of fascination for us and the subject for what we made with our film, The Toxic Camera. Here's some images that we found in the Kiev archive.
This is a place called Pirogovo, which is just on the outskirts of Kiev. And I think it's interesting because we conducted a lot of interviews with people at this point, and certainly meeting the surviving crew that worked with Shevchenko, because he died 8 months after filming in Chernobyl of dispersed radiation. So it was quite traumatic, but in terms of a history, but also going to see Victor, Vladimir and Anatoly are the 3 surviving crew that we met with. And they were the ones that mentioned that actually the camera, which is what Louise was referring to, the Convas Automat, was considered so toxic 2 years afterwards, in terms of the levels of radioactivity that were coming from it. It was removed from the building and taken somewhere out the outskirts of Kiev and buried along with all of the other radioactive material that was taken from the disaster. And so it was basically what that became actually the film that we wanted to create, which was to try and trace where this camera was buried.
So I just wanted to kind of read just very quickly, if that's all right, just a quick sort of, just in relation to Shevchenko's film, Chernobyl, A Chronicle of Difficult Weeks. His film is an extraordinary close-up record of the efforts to contain and clear up the disaster, but it was also a compelling document of the physical effects of radiation itself on film. When Shevchenko had first processed his film, he noticed that portions of it were heavily pockmarked and seemingly affected by static interference. He mistakenly thought that this interference was caused by faulty film stock. However, when he subsequently played back his film footage, he realized that each time the image deteriorated, it coincided with the sound of the Geiger counter, and that was captured on his film. So that there was no fault with the actual processing. Shevchenko had, in actual fact, captured the effect of radiation on film for the first time. And I'd like to quote Dr. Susan Shupley, who's the director of forensic architecture course at Goldsmiths, in her essay, The Most Dangerous Film in the World. She says, arguably what is fascinating about Shevchenko's film is its transformation from a conventional documentary or benign media artifact into a radioactive fossil through the mysterious intercession of an invisible agent. So our fascination with Shevchenko's film is that by capturing the effects of radiation directly onto the film stock, it not only was a document of an event, but it became an actual event itself. So as Jane said, he died less than a year later. But, you know, this was for us fascinating to see his film. And so we began to kind of think, well, rather than going back and filming in Pripyat, which there might have been some idea of doing that after we made these large-scale images, that actually the narrative was elsewhere. And the narrative was much more following what had happened to Shevchenko's camera, because it was, again, more explicit about that element of dark tourism and thinking about how our fascination with capturing disaster or looking at disaster. You see these bus loads that go from Kiev. I mean, it's not on a regular basis, but people do go as tourists, you know, to visit this site. And so we kind of thought, well, actually, what we wanted to do was actually consider that act of looking and that act of documentation, and to think about the camera, the technology behind that, the way of capturing that, but also the toxic camera, a camera that was irradiated. The body had become so irradiated, as Jane mentioned, that it had to be removed from the film stool.
Yeah.
So this is a shot of Piragovo.
And you can see these are obviously measuring devices that they have in the atmosphere to test exactly the scale, as well as the Geiger counter. And that's actually the burial site. So what it would be things would be layered under concrete, essentially, and then a line of lead. And so it's kind of clad. I guess there's still seepages, especially when it rains. Levels are particularly, they have to be recorded. But in terms of us actually going back to film, we obviously didn't spend too long in the dirty zone, and we were pretty economic about what we wanted to record. So this is obviously the camera equipment getting getting tested, I suppose. I think everything had to be swabbed to make sure for levels.
Okay. And this is a cast of the Convas Aftermath, which was the same camera not the camera, I hasten to add, because
don't think we could get our hands on that.
Buried outside of Kiev in Piragovo, but it was the same model of camera, bought on eBay, and it's got a certain patina, so it looks like lead. I mean, lead's actually very difficult to cast. Well, it's not difficult to cast, but it's just very soft. So this was actually in bronze with a patina to make it look as though it
was dead.
It was dead. It was like lead, but it also sat on a concrete plinth. And this is an installation view that's actually on the poster, but of a show that we did at the Whitworth Art Gallery in 2012.
Yeah.
And this is an installation view of the toxic camera in front of the film installation, the toxic camera. Well, yeah. So
and we also actually had a screen alongside, which would be of the film Chronicle of Difficult Weeks, which was Shevchenko's document as well. So there was actually his documentary, which we screened alongside the film that we made. So there was a sense of, I mean, it was very important to have that as well. You can see it there.
That's on the monitor at the back is Chronicle of Difficult Weeks with subtitles. So here we can see.
I mean, it's a very, Soviet thing to say Chronicle of Difficult Weeks. I mean, obviously it was a catastrophe, but I mean, it was the biggest nuclear meltdown that's ever happened. So, there was a kind of sense of playing this down, but there was a feeling, a kind of sacrifice, I suppose, on a scale that probably we wouldn't quite have appreciated, because, I mean, they took their entire military from Afghanistan, who were busy there, and brought all the helicopters out to try and literally contain this burning reactor. And it took several days to actually stop stop it from burning. But also just in terms of the radioactive cloud, the way that it travelled, it was kind of quite been darkly described as this kind of fleur-de-lis that kind of came through. Fleur-de-mal, yes, but it sort of came out. And it actually stretched over up to Sweden, across to the to Wales and England, but all the way down to Turkey, to right down to the south. So it was a huge toxic mass that kind of travelled through. And I guess it was the thing that was strange about it was that actually it kind of did preempt what happened in terms of Glasnost, because of course it meant that once the Swedes had alerted us that 3 weeks after this they were getting these incredible levels of radioactivity, and nobody had made any announcements nobody in the Soviet Union had made any announcements about it. They had to call them and say, this is what's happening. And so, of course, at that point, there had to be this, as we said, this thawing of relations, and I guess this kind of glasnost started to happen where the Soviet Union had to talk to the rest of the Western Europe, because clearly there was this disaster had occurred. So
just to follow on, just to finish that sort of somehow, is that the film Chronicle of Difficult Weeks was suppressed by the Soviet authorities for 6 months. And when it was finally released, it was not in Moscow, but at the Tbilisi Film Festival in Georgia, 2 months after Shevchenko's death. The Russian press at the time said that the film was contaminated by radioactive particles, which showed up on the screen as the visible face of radiation. The Tbilisi Film Festival said that Shevchenko was an outstanding man who gave his life so that we and our descendants could see with our own eyes all the horror and depth of the Chernobyl tragedy. Shevchenko's film was a 35mm, film camera was a 35mm Russian Bolex camera called the Konvas Avtomat. His camera had been kept after he'd finished his filming at the documentary film school in Kiev, where he had taught. However, 2 years after his death, the camera was removed as it had become so thoroughly radioactive that it recorded over 60 times the tolerable levels of radiation for one adult. It was subsequently removed and buried in Pirogovo, a nuclear waste facility on the outskirts of Kiev. Professor Caroline Wilkinson, who we discussed with, comments further, and she says that the idea of radioactive forensic film and camera is so fascinating that the moment and the event are captured in time as a process as well as an image is the ultimate forensic experience.
So should we show a clip? I think we might just have a quick clip of the toxic camera. These are stills from the film, and you can get an impression there of the film.
It's 20 minutes, so it won't.
We won't show 20 minutes, so we'll just give you... This is the installation.
It's here somewhere. I can't remember. The map said we were in a village, but I couldn't see any village. We had followed the militia there, who were just finishing off sealing the houses. I was trying to make my way through the weeds, and then suddenly, amongst the trees, I started to see the houses. They were abandoned. Everything was covered in weeds. The yard, the path, everything. The silence was so intense that it was ringing. And suddenly I heard something go boom. And in those surroundings, there is this extremely beautiful apple tree. And the whole yard is covered in those beautiful apples.
Those radionuclides saturate the film because their energy functions in the same way as light. The same way they saturate your lungs, your eyes. And we had to be quick because the film would even get overexposed from the camera itself.
The Converse camera is a multi-lens camera with a spinning mirrored shutter, a feature that allows the cinematographer to look directly into the scene of the crime. With its anomalous shutter opening of 155 degrees, smaller than the standard 180, Shevchenko's camera would logically have limited the amount of incoming atmospheric data. Yet, his film stock was still thoroughly contaminated. Shevchenko's camera had become an actual lethal weapon, requiring its immediate decommissioning and disposal.
Obviously there's a bit more to screen of that film, but anyway, we'll just keep moving on now. And in 2012 we were commissioned to create first publicly sighted installation on Orford Ness. And it was important that what was an evidence of the UK Cold War past in our film, The Toxic Camera, Orford Ness had been decommissioned in the 1990s and was handed over to the National Trust to manage. The laboratory testing buildings had been left gradually to decay as the Trust wanted to blend the island to become a nature reserve. So they ran a policy of preservation as opposed to conservation towards the buildings. So when you visit the island, there's something strange about a perception. So this is the view from across the water to the island. There's something view about the perception of scale. It distorts, contracts and expands depending from which perspective you look. At the shore, the island, the architecture appears almost embedded as though camouflaged, and the first encounter of viewing it on the boat. And when you land on the island, the scale of the buildings begins to reveal itself and can appear quite epic. So, however, when you actually do physically arrive there, you realise that actually they are very in proportion to the landscape. So there's something strange about this distortion. And it was interesting, again, for us to intervene there in terms of what scale was, in terms of them as an image of menace. So we wanted to reduce them to the concrete structures that they really were. And in doing so, we wanted to cite some literal measures. So we used...
Yeah, so this is actually a whole measuring chamber. I mean, you can actually see there's numbers.
They use these for basically for
Vibration
testing. Yeah. So again, I mean, what was interesting was that's the image that we.
So this is and this is actually, well, this is the measure.
Mm-hmm.
You can see, it actually stretched up to the ceiling.
Mm.
So just to give you an idea of the scale, I mean, this is our photograph. This is a large format image, but to give you an idea of the scale, the actual measure itself was installed at the Whitworth Art Gallery in 2012, and this is the top view of it, and this is the actual size of it. So you can kind of get an idea of how big this chamber was, but that it would actually have been filled with water to suspend the H-bomb casing. And we just thought this looked like this extraordinary sort of kind of almost religious with the crosses and with this kind of numbers and this measuring, and you know, this architecture was sort of really compelling, you know. So
they call them the pagodas because, of course, they've kind of got this a very strange design function, which meant that essentially having the vented top that it is, so if there was an explosion, what it would mean would be that the top would lift up and then fall back down and seal what was inside.
Yeah, I think if it was explosion, sorry, was that, am I right? But but also the shingle would come in
yes.
and sort of, so apparently it was incredibly effective. But again, it's sort of the idea of a pagoda. It's almost like of a temple, but you know, of a sort of but you know, this very Catholic imagery, etc. But we also wanted, I mean, if we'd screened more of the Toxic Camera, the film, you would have seen that we actually filmed in Orford Ness as well, because we really wanted to kind of include something of what was a very, you know, British Cold War past, if you like. That this site was kind of important as well, to show something of that. And here's one of the pagodas. So again, there's another measure.
And it was actually open for 2 weeks. It ran as an installation, so you could get a boat across the island and come and see some of these pagodas and see these interventions into the buildings. And it also had some sound, which we recorded, just amped up what was the existing atmos in there, and then re-recorded that so that it just basically played alongside. So it was a very heightened sense of space. So let's move on to the last piece, I think. So in 2014, we were commissioned by the Arts Council and the Imperial War Museum in London to make a new work to coincide with the centenary of the First World War. We began by researching in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, looking specifically at surveillance equipment and the research accounts from the very first documentary cameraman who had photographed
on the front line in 2014. So
1914.
Sorry, 1914. Sorry, excuse me.
2014.
Oh, God,
that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, meant.
So don't worry. So the research was primarily at the Imperial War Museum archive, referencing specifically archive images of early surveillance and camouflage techniques employed during the First World War. And building on our long-standing interest in technology and architecture of conflict, the film explored perspectives around visibility, technology, and the reconstruction of narratives from that period. We wanted to blend animation, historical photography, and stage scenes to underscore what was a strange relationship between warfare, technological progress, and emphasizing the evolving surveillance and propaganda programs of World War I. So what you're looking at here are images from the Imperial War Museum archive there. That was of a tank decoy.
Oh, sorry, yes.
That was a decoy tank.
Yeah.
So these are interesting things, because I suppose what you realised is in that expanded moment from 1914 to 1918, there was this enormous progression in terms of the technology around what modern warfare would subsequently become. Because, of course, you suddenly had the air. You had aerial surveillance, and you also had...
Well, you didn't suddenly have the air.
But you had the air as an area.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, we always had the air. But you had the air, you had air, I guess you had, you had that as a space to then be able to survey, but also to be able to, drop, anyway, to attack.
Yeah, and these are some installation views of... as it was shown, the film Undead Sun as it was shown at the Imperial War Museum. These are again images from the archive. so you can see how they became. And then at the end of the film, we looked at an account of a conscientious objector from 1916. I must get that, from 1916. And particularly because, you know, it felt we were doing this work to kind of almost commemorate the First World War, but also showing it in the Imperial War Museum, and to kind of think actually, you know, how we might highlight, you know, in a way that there was protest at the time, and there were people who were clearly against the war. And to look at the position of conscientious objectors, there is an account in the Imperial War Museum of one individual who was held overnight and forced to undress, and was told that basically he was held outside. The only thing he could wear for protection was a uniform, and he refused to wear the uniform. And then in the end, he actually shred the uniform.
So he systematically shredded it and pinned it on the bottom.
We thought this was a compelling account, in a way, of shredding the material. And so this is the final sequence. Sorry,
so we'll
that's
just
back
show a
to me.
brief clip of this, and then we can have some questions at the
Yeah.
end.
On the ground, you can only hide if you are able to imagine the view of yourself as seen from above. As space runs backwards, like a strip of film from the plane's tail, through its very presence, as the gate, bulb, aperture, and projection point, the tunnel operates as a valve, regulating flow. It is a kind of measuring, a spacing out of space in such a way that distant objects loom up close, and nearby ones expand, their edges hurtling away beyond all visible horizons. Gauze curls around his forearms. Lichen stains his clothes. The landscape seems to penetrate his skin and grow inside him, replacing viscera and brain with heather, lavender, and fern.
I just wanted to say finally as well that actually we should mention that the text was from Tom McCarthy's book Sea, which is a brilliant novel, because we realised obviously Tom had also researched into the archives of the Imperial War Museum when he was writing his book Sea.
Yeah.
And also a text from the writer Hannah Rose Schell and her book on camouflage. Okay, so thank you.
So yes, I mean, happy to take any questions.
Yeah.
I wonder how. Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. I'm really interested in how you started collaborating. How old were you when you made your first collaborative artwork, and who takes what responsibility, and how does that work?
I don't know. I mean, I guess we were first collaborated. Well, when we covered each other with our own excrement, yeah.
I'm sorry, it did beg that one, really.
Well, yes, so you wouldn't have known that, but yes, we did have a very fecund moment when we were little. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, we've then
We
progressed.
might reenact that one day. I mean, you know, it's possible.
No, I mean, I think it's key that obviously the first piece that we showed there of the large-scale photograph, I mean, that was when we kind of outed ourselves as a collaboration and became recognised in 1989 when we graduated with those works. I suppose was the first public showing of us.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess, and also to follow on, thank you for your question. I mean, also to follow on is, you know, that, you know, really thinking about the role of who does what, in a sense, is it's hopefully you're trying to create a space that's much more liberated than it is about defining, you know, your role and your position within it, you know. So, you know, I think your role just comes down to what you feel is necessary in a way, and what you feel you can bring to it, and hopefully that's you know, part of the surprise and the pleasure of working together is that actually you don't know what you're going to end up with, in a way.
I think in a way, from what we've seen today, what you've shown today, every work is kind of a investigation into the past. I'm just wondering, like, what your future projects are, or if there's a different way of looking from you guys.
Yeah. It's a kind of selection that you've just seen most recently. I mean, obviously not all of the work would have been so keyed into an archive and looking from that perspective. Certainly these three pieces completely from the Kubrick work and from Toxic, and yes,
and obviously the Imperial War Museum.
But you know, we have created other pieces where it's been looking at surveillance and looking at other materials. Certainly the piece Face Crypting, What Did the Buildings See? Also other pieces that
was looking at YouTube footage released by the Dubai State Police, and in a way there are like 4 bodies of work we're missing out from, you know, from that period that we're not showing just because, you know, just for time, etc. And we're also missing a piece called Spiteful of Dream, which was working with Bosnian Refugee Centre in Derby, that piece. as well as face scripting What Did the Buildings See, which was 2011, and was looking, much more at an event that had happened the year before in 2010 with the assassination of the Hamas operative Mahmoud al-Mabhouh. So in his Dubai hotel room. So there was other works, but actually within that sense, in a way, I think it's yes, it's perhaps looking at an historical past, but there's that that idea of the past also being sort of slightly remembering the future. I mean, how odd that, in a way, looking at Chernobyl and looking at the toxic camera, and it was made in 2012. In 2011, Fukushima happened. So, this was something that actually, in a way, and at the end of the film, we talk about that. It's mentioned, actually, it is kind of almost a premonition, in a way, of what happened. So, history seems very embedded in the past, but actually it's, there is something very premonition-like in some respects of some events. Yeah.
Just your shows coming up in the US, can you review anything, or they're secrets now?
I don't know whether it's secret. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we didn't show any of the images.
Actually, I mean, to be fair, I think it's best the museums release that somehow, in a way.
Sure. Yeah.
But
it's. I mean, it will be January 2017 at the Getty, so it's their focus
and it's in
gallery.
February. February 2017. At the Getty Museum, and in 2018, date to be confirmed. Also, the lineup to be confirmed on that, but it will be showing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Just I'm very interested in the way in which, I mean, obviously there are a lot of film references, but I couldn't help thinking about Brecht when I was watching that last sort of staging of the people with the kind of masks, in a sense, and there seems to be a sort of interest in theatre, actually, and in props and
totally
materiality that isn't necessarily so filmic. It sort of seems to belong to a slightly other tradition. I just wondered if you could say something about that.
Well, I think it's also because we're looking very much at that artifact from the museum, and so obviously there are things that would be there preserved but also on display, so there was something about incorporating them and then using that site, the actual wind tunnels, which is where it was where we filmed in Farnborough, where basically you see those huge structures that very much contain all of the rest of this kind of repositioning of what was these kind of artifacts. I think that was very key to show that this is actually the thing that's driving through all of this aerial activity, and also using those images, those animations. I mean, they're basically reconstructions of the airflow animations that were created around.
It's from the Shell archive.
Yeah. So but the new piece that we're doing for MIMA will be very different to that. So obviously it's not going to be. Obviously you wouldn't know because I haven't made it yet. But it's a very different. It will have a very different aesthetic. It's not looking at the artifact in the same sense, or certainly not from that period.
Yeah.
It's more sort of bringing it into the present.
Yeah, and that's and also I just think, we're obviously very naturally interested in the mechanics of cinema and of looking at sort of how you can work with the camera as well, and thinking about of course, like amazing filmmakers like Fassbinder, who was a theatre director. Actually there's something imbued in the way that he directs that I don't think you see in too many other directors. So I think there is something really interesting about the staging and looking at this kind of performative. Oddly enough, it might even relate to that very early image of Garage, of the props and of the performance.
Okay, thank you very much.